There's nothing harder than watching the woman who raised you slowly fade away, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. Donovan Keller had already lost his father to the mountains, and now his mother Constance was slipping away too, her breathing growing weaker each day. When he found a cabin for sale for just $200 near Whitefish Lake, it seemed like the answer to his prayers. A quiet place where his mother could spend her final days in peace, away from the dust and noise of town. The seller was eager to get rid of it, and the photos showed a simple cabin by a beautiful lake with mountains all around. But when they arrived, Donovan realized why the price was so low. Strange things happened in that cabin at night. The floorboards creaked with footsteps when no one was walking. Marks appeared in the snow outside their door. And beneath the frozen lake, something had been buried for a very long time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Donovan Keller had hands that told stories, thick fingers scarred from years of handling timber, palms calloused from rope and axe handles, knuckles that had been split and healed more times than he could count. At 43, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent his life wrestling with nature and usually winning. His beard, more salt than pepper now, framed a face weathered by mountain winds and marked by crow's feet that deepened when he smiled, which happened less frequently these days. He'd been born in these Montana mountains, raised in a logging camp where his father worked the timber crews that fed the mills down in the valley. Those were good years, when the forests seemed endless and the work was honest. His father, Big Jim Keller, had been a legend among the loggers, a man who could drop 100-foot pine exactly where he wanted it, who could read the mountain weather like scripture, who taught his son that the wilderness demanded respect but rewarded those who understood its ways. The accident had taken Big Jim when Donovan was 25. A widowmaker, a broken branch caught high in the canopy, had finally fallen after hanging there for who knew how long. It caught him across the shoulders as he was walking away from a fresh-cut tree, drove him face first into the rocky ground. The other loggers said he was dead before they reached him. But Donovan always wondered if his father had lain there for those few precious minutes, listening to the mountain silence and thinking about the wife and son he was leaving behind. After the funeral, Donovan couldn't bring himself to return to the logging crews. The sound of chainsaws made his chest tight, and the sight of falling timber brought back memories that cut deeper than any blade. Instead, he'd turned to guiding, taking city folks into the backcountry, teaching them to fish the high lakes and track elk through the timber. It was quieter work, more solitary, and it suited him. The mountains had taken his father, but they'd also shaped him, and he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. His mother, Constance, had been the anchor that kept him grounded through those dark months after Big Jim's death. She was a small woman with steel in her spine, the kind who could make a pot of stew stretch to feed unexpected guests and somehow make everyone feel welcome at her table. She'd worked at the grain mill in town for 30 years, breathing dust and machinery noise, saving every penny she could for Donovan's future, but time and that mill dust had taken their toll. The cough started 3 years ago, just a little rasp at first, nothing that seemed worth worrying about. By last winter, she was struggling to climb the stairs to her bedroom. The doctors in town had done their tests and delivered their verdict with the cold precision of men who'd given too much bad news. Pulmonary fibrosis, they called it. Scarring in the lungs from years of breathing particles too small to see but persistent enough to kill. There was no cure, only the slow decline toward an inevitable end. Donovan had brought her to specialists in Billings, even driven her all the way to Seattle to see a lung expert who charged more for one visit than most people made in a month. The verdict was always the same: keep her comfortable. Make the most of the time you have left. Consider hospice care when the breathing gets too difficult. But Donovan wasn't ready to give up. There had to be something, some clean mountain air, some peaceful place where she could rest and maybe, just maybe, find a little more time. That's when he'd started looking for a cabin. Somewhere remote enough to escape the dust and noise of town, but close enough to civilization that he could get help if needed. The listing had appeared on a bulletin board at the general store in Kalispell. A handwritten note, the kind of thing that usually advertised firewood for sale or puppies looking for homes. But this one had caught his eye. Cabin for sale, Whitefish Lake area. $200. Contact J. Morrison for details. $200 for lakefront property seemed impossible. But the phone number was real, and when he called, a nervous-sounding man had agreed to meet him that very afternoon. J. Morrison turned out to be a thin, twitchy fellow in his 60s who chain-smoked cigarettes and couldn't seem to look Donovan in the eye. He'd inherited the cabin from his uncle, he explained, and just wanted to be rid of it. "Never been up there myself," Morrison had said, ashes from his cigarette falling onto the photographs he'd spread across the diner table. "Uncle Pete was, well, he was a strange one. Lived up there alone for 20 years. Never came to town except for supplies. Found him dead in the cabin 3 months ago." The photographs showed exactly what Donovan had been hoping for. A simple log structure with a stone chimney, situated on a small rise above a pristine mountain lake. The surrounding forest looked untouched, and in the background, snow-capped peaks rose like cathedral spires against a brilliant blue sky. It looked like paradise, the kind of place where a dying woman might find peace and her son might find hope. Morrison had been eager to complete the sale, accepting Donovan's cash without even asking for paperwork. "Take these too," he'd said, pushing a set of old-fashioned skeleton keys across the table. "And this." The deed was yellow with age, the paper soft as cloth from handling. It showed the property boundaries and a notation that the cabin had been built in 1923. "Just promise me something," Morrison had added as they shook hands. "Whatever you find up there, whatever Uncle Pete left behind, just leave it be. Some things are better left buried." The drive to Whitefish Lake took them through country that grew more remote with each passing mile. They'd started on the main highway, but within an hour they were following logging roads that wound deeper into the mountains. Constance sat quietly in the passenger seat, wrapped in quilts and breathing carefully through the oxygen tube that had become her constant companion. But Donovan noticed her eyes brightening as they climbed higher, away from the valley smog and into air that smelled of pine and snow. "It's beautiful." "Danny," she said, using the childhood nickname that no one else was allowed to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was wonder in it. "Your father would have loved this country." The final approach to the cabin required leaving the truck at the end of an overgrown trail and hiking the last quarter-mile through snow that crunched under their boots. Donovan carried their supplies and helped his mother navigate the uneven ground, moving slowly to accommodate her labored breathing. But when they crested the small rise and saw the cabin for the first time, both of them stopped in their tracks. The photographs hadn't done it justice. The lake stretched before them like a mirror, so clear they could see the rocky bottom even in the deeper sections. Ancient pines crowded the shoreline, their branches heavy with snow. And beyond the far shore, the mountains rose in layers of purple and white until they seemed to touch the sky itself. The cabin sat perfectly positioned to capture the view, its windows facing the water like eyes that had been watching this scene for decades. But there was something else, a quality to the silence that felt different from the usual mountain quiet. It was too complete, too absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no whisper of wind through the trees. Even the lake was perfectly still, its surface unbroken by the rings that fish usually made when they rose to feed. "Strange how quiet it is," Constance observed, her words creating small puffs of vapor in the cold air. Donovan nodded, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. His years in the mountains had taught him to read the signs, and something here felt off. Wildlife avoided places for reasons: predators, disease, or sometimes just some indefinable wrongness that animals sensed better than humans. But his mother was already walking toward the cabin, moving with more energy than she'd shown in months. and he forced himself to focus on the practical matters at hand. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal an interior that was surprisingly well preserved. The previous owner had clearly been a man of simple tastes but practical skills. Hand-hewn furniture filled the main room, and a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. The floorboards were wide pine planks, darkened with age but solid underfoot. Windows on 3 sides provided panoramic views of the lake and mountains, and the afternoon sun streaming through the glass made everything feel warm and welcoming. "Oh, Danny," Constance breathed, settling carefully into a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. "This is perfect. This is exactly what we needed." Donovan spent the rest of the daylight hours making the cabin habitable. He brought in firewood from a well-stocked woodshed, checked the hand pump that drew water from a deep well, and tested the propane system that fed the stove and lanterns. Everything worked perfectly, as if the previous owner had prepared the place for exactly this moment. As evening approached, he built a fire in the fireplace and prepared a simple dinner. Constance ate more than she had in weeks, color returning to her pale cheeks as the warmth filled the room. For the first time in months, Donovan allowed himself to hope that they'd made the right decision. But as full darkness settled over the lake, the quality of the silence began to change. What had seemed peaceful during the day now felt expectant, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls. And somewhere in those shifting patterns, Donovan thought he saw shapes that didn't belong, faces in the flames, figures moving just beyond the edge of vision. He was just tired, he told himself. It had been a long day, and the stress of the past months was finally catching up with him. But as he helped his mother prepare for bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness beyond the windows. Patient and ancient and not entirely benevolent. The last thing he remembered before sleep took him was the sound of his mother's gentle breathing from the bedroom, steady and peaceful for the first time in months. Whatever else this place might hold, it was already giving her something she desperately needed. And for that, Donovan was willing to overlook almost anything, even the growing certainty that they were not alone in this remote wilderness, and that whatever shared the mountain with them had been waiting a very long time for their arrival. Donovan woke to the sound of his mother's voice drifting from the main room, soft and conversational, as if she were speaking with an old friend. The morning light filtering through the bedroom window was crisp and golden, promising another clear mountain day. He'd slept better than he had in months, the mountain air and complete silence working better than any medicine. Morning already came too soon, he muttered to himself, stretching muscles that felt more relaxed than they'd been since this whole ordeal began. But as he listened more carefully to his mother's voice, something made him pause. She was speaking to someone, but he hadn't heard anyone arrive, and the isolation of their location made unexpected visitors unlikely. "Yes, I understand," Constance was saying, her voice clearer and stronger than it had been in weeks. "You've been waiting such a long time." Donovan pulled on his clothes and stepped into the main room, expecting to find his mother on the phone or perhaps talking to herself, something she'd started doing occasionally as her medication affected her thinking. Instead, he found her sitting in the rocking chair by the fireplace, staring intently at the empty chair across from her, speaking as naturally as if someone were sitting there. "Morning." "Ma," he said gently, not wanting to startle her. "Who were you talking to?" Constance turned to him with a smile that was brighter than any he'd seen from her in months. "Oh, just an old friend, dear. She was telling me about the history of this place. Did you know this land was sacred to the native people? They used to come here for ceremonies." Donovan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He looked around the empty room, then back at his mother's face, which showed no sign of confusion or embarrassment. "Ma, there's nobody here but us." "Of course, dear," she said, patting his hand as he knelt beside her chair. "She left when she heard you stirring. Some people are shy about meeting strangers." Constance's eyes were clear and focused, none of the cloudiness that usually accompanied her more confused moments. Whatever she thought she'd experienced, it felt completely real to her. Deciding not to press the issue, Donovan busied himself with making breakfast and beginning the repairs the cabin clearly needed. The place was structurally sound, but decades of minimal maintenance had left their mark. Loose floorboards creaked underfoot. Some of the window frames had warped enough to let in drafts, and the kitchen area needed attention. As he worked on tightening the floorboards in the kitchen, he discovered something that made him pause. One of the wide pine planks near the table was darker than the others, stained with something that had soaked deep into the wood. When he pried it up to investigate, the underside revealed more of the same, dark stains that looked suspiciously like old blood. "Now what were you up to, Pete?" he murmured, running his fingers along the stained wood. The previous owner's nephew had mentioned that Uncle Pete was found dead in the cabin, but he hadn't provided any details about the circumstances. The discovery prompted Donovan to make a trip into the nearest town, a collection of buildings optimistically called Cedar Falls that sat 30 miles down the mountain. He needed supplies anyway, and a few questions might shed light on the cabin's history and its previous owner. Cedar Falls consisted of a general store, a diner, a post office, and a bar that looked like it had been serving the same customers since Prohibition ended. Donovan stopped first at the general store, where a heavy-set woman behind the counter looked him over with the calculating gaze of someone who knew everyone within 50. "Miles, you'd be the fellow who bought Pete Carlisle's place," she said before he could introduce himself. "Word travels fast around here." "I'm Betty Morrison, Jim's sister. He said you paid cash and didn't ask too many questions." "Seemed like a fair deal," Donovan replied, loading supplies into a basket. "Beautiful location. I'm curious about the previous owner, though. Your brother mentioned he died up there." Betty's expression grew guarded. "Pete kept to himself. Lived up at that cabin for 20 years, maybe more. Came to town maybe 4 times a year for supplies and medicine. Always paid cash, never caused trouble, but there were stories." "What kind of stories?" "The kind folks whisper about but don't repeat to strangers," Betty said firmly. "If you're smart, you'll mind your own business and let sleeping dogs lie. That cabin's got a history that goes back further than Pete Carlisle." Donovan tried a different approach. "I found some stained floorboards. Looked like blood. Was there an accident?" Betty's face went pale, and she glanced around the empty store as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Pete was found with his head caved in," she said quietly. "Sheriff ruled it an accident, said he must have fallen and hit his head on the fireplace stones. But Pete was steady on his feet even at his age. And there were other things." "What other things?" "Things that don't make sense to say out loud. Tools scattered around like someone had been digging. Furniture moved around. And Pete's face," she shuddered. "He looked terrified, even in death. Like he'd seen something that scared him to death before whatever killed him finished the job." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, and Betty's demeanor immediately shifted back to professional friendliness. But as Donovan paid for his supplies, she leaned close and whispered, "If you've got any sense, you'll pack up your things and find somewhere else for your mother to spend her time. That place isn't right. Never has been." The drive back to the cabin gave Donovan time to process what he'd learned. Pete Carlisle had lived alone for decades in a remote location, had died under suspicious circumstances, and had apparently been digging for something before his death. The blood-stained floorboard suddenly took on new significance. He found Constance exactly where he'd left her, sitting by the fireplace and looking more vibrant than she had in months. The mountain air was clearly agreeing with her, and her breathing seemed easier. Whatever was happening with her occasional conversations with invisible companions, the physical benefits of their location were undeniable. "How was your trip to town, dear?" she asked as he carried in the supplies. "Informative," he replied, deciding not to share the details of his conversation with Betty Morrison. "The folks down there remember Pete Carlisle. Seems he was quite the character." "Oh, yes," Constance said with a knowing smile. "The ladies here tell me all about him. He wasn't a nice man, Danny. He hurt people, and he took things that didn't belong to him. But in the end, the mountain took care of him. Donovan stopped unpacking and looked at his mother carefully. "What ladies, Ma? You haven't left this chair since I've been gone. The ones who visit, dear. They're very kind once you get to know them. They've been waiting so long for someone to listen to their stories." Constance's voice carried absolute conviction, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been excitement. That evening, as Donovan prepared dinner, he paid closer attention to the cabin's atmosphere. The silence he'd noted the day before was still present, but now he realized it wasn't completely empty. There were subtle sounds, creaks and settles that old buildings made, but with a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. The shadows cast by the firelight seemed to move independently of the flames, and more than once he caught himself turning to look at movement that wasn't there. As they sat down to eat, Constance paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "They're telling me there's something under the lake," she said conversationally. "Something that Pete took from them a long time ago. They want it back. Ma, you're scaring me a little bit." "Who exactly is talking to you?" Constance looked at him with the patient expression she'd used when he was a child asking too many questions. "The ones who were here first, Danny. The ones who never left. They're not angry with us. We're not the ones who wronged them. But they need our help to set things right." That night, as Donovan lay in bed listening to the absolute silence of the mountain, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps on the front porch, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin like someone was looking for a way in. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and crept to the window. But the beam revealed nothing but snow and shadow. When he checked on his mother, she was sleeping peacefully, a small smile on her face, as if she were having pleasant dreams. But written in the frost on her bedroom window, barely visible in the flashlight beam, were symbols that looked almost like letters, scratches in the ice that definitely hadn't been there when they'd gone to bed. As he returned to his own room, Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple real estate transaction. The cabin might be healing his mother, but it was also home to forces that had their own agenda. And somewhere beneath the frozen lake, something was waiting that Pete Carlisle had died trying to protect, or perhaps trying to retrieve. The next morning brought a clarity that made the previous night's fears seem foolish. Donovan examined the frost patterns on his mother's window in the bright daylight, and found nothing more than the random crystals that form naturally in cold weather. The scratches he'd thought he'd seen were gone, if they'd ever been there at all. Stress and isolation could play tricks on a man's mind, and he'd been under more pressure than usual lately. "Just your imagination running wild," he told himself as he started a fire in the fireplace. But even as he tried to rationalize the experience, he found himself paying closer attention to details he might have missed before. Constance was awake early, sitting in her favorite chair and looking out at the lake with an expression of deep contentment. Her color was better than it had been in months, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that had been absent for far too long. "I slept wonderfully. Danny, this place is healing me. I can feel it in my bones." Donovan wanted to share her optimism, but the practical side of his nature demanded answers. If they were going to stay here through the winter, he needed to understand what they were dealing with. The cabin required significant work to be truly habitable long-term, and each repair seemed to reveal new mysteries. He started with the foundation, checking for structural issues that might explain some of the strange sounds they'd been hearing. The cabin was built on a stone foundation that extended deeper into the ground than he'd expected. As he worked his way around the perimeter, clearing away decades of accumulated debris, he noticed something odd about the construction. The stones weren't randomly placed like most frontier foundations. They were arranged in deliberate patterns, with certain rocks positioned at precise intervals around the structure. Some of the stones had markings carved into them, symbols that looked old and deliberate, though he couldn't interpret their meaning. Native American, maybe? He wondered aloud, tracing one of the carved symbols with his finger. The markings were deep and weathered, clearly much older than the cabin itself. It seemed that Pete Carlyle had built his home on top of something that predated him by generations. The discovery prompted him to examine the interior walls more carefully. What he'd initially taken for normal settling cracks revealed themselves to be intentional gaps, spaces where the logs had been fitted together to create hidden compartments. Most were empty, containing nothing but spiderwebs and mouse droppings. But behind a loose board near the fireplace, his fingers found the edge of something that crackled like old paper. Working carefully to avoid damage, he extracted a rolled document that felt fragile as autumn leaves. It was a surveyor's map, hand-drawn and dated 1881, showing the lake and surrounding area in remarkable detail. But what caught his attention weren't the surface features. It was the network of lines beneath the lake, clearly marking underground passages and cave systems. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, spreading the map on the kitchen table. The underground network was extensive, with several large chambers connected by narrow passages. According to the map, at least 3 of the cave systems extended beneath the cabin itself, which explained some of the strange acoustic properties he'd noticed. The map also showed markings around the lake's perimeter that corresponded to the stone formations he'd found in the foundation. Someone, possibly the original surveyors, or maybe the native people who'd used this land before them, had mapped this location with extraordinary precision and marked it as significant. As he studied the map, Constance approached the table with careful steps, her breathing still labored, but her eyes bright with curiosity. "What did you find, dear?" "Looks like this place has been important for a long time," he said, pointing to the markings. "See these symbols? They match the carvings on the foundation stones. And look at this. There are caves under the lake, big ones." Constance leaned closer, and as her finger traced the underground passages, she suddenly went very still. "They used to gather there," she said quietly, "in the big chamber, right there in the center, for ceremonies and healing rituals. The water was considered sacred. How do you know that, Ma?" She looked at him with the same patient expression he'd seen the night before. "The ladies told me. They remember when their people would come here every summer for the healing ceremonies. The water has special properties. That's why I'm feeling so much better." Donovan felt the familiar chill that seemed to accompany his mother's mysterious conversations. But looking at her improved color and increased energy, he couldn't deny that something about this location was having a positive effect on her health. Whether it was the clean mountain air, the reduced stress, or something more mysterious, she was clearly benefiting from their move. That afternoon, he decided to explore the immediate area around the cabin more thoroughly. The previous owner had clearly spent time outdoors. There were worn paths leading in several directions from the main building, and evidence of extensive digging in various locations. One path led to a small clearing about 100 yards from the cabin, where the snow was thinner and the ground showed signs of recent disturbance. Someone had been digging here, and recently. The excavation marks were too fresh to have been made by Pete Carlyle before his death months ago. The holes were roughly circular, about 3 feet across, and they'd been filled back in with loose dirt and stones. Donovan knelt beside one of the filled holes and began carefully removing the loose material. About 2 feet down, his hand encountered something hard and smooth. Working more carefully, he uncovered what appeared to be a carved stone disc, about the size of a dinner plate and covered with the same type of symbols he'd found on the foundation stones. The disc was warm to the touch, despite being buried in frozen ground, and as he lifted it from the hole, he felt a strange vibration running through the stone, almost like a heartbeat. The sensation was so unexpected that he nearly dropped the artifact. But as he held it steady, the vibration settled into a rhythm that seemed to match his own pulse. "Now what the hell are you?" he whispered, turning the disc over to examine both sides. The carvings were intricate and clearly very old, but they'd been preserved perfectly by their burial in the cold ground. Whatever this thing was, someone had considered it important enough to hide. As he walked back toward the cabin, with the disc wrapped in his jacket, Donovan noticed that the wildlife was still avoiding the area. No birds called from the trees, no small animals rustled in the underbrush, and even the insects that should have been active during the warmer part of the day were absent. The entire ecosystem around the lake seemed to be holding its breath. When he entered the cabin, Constance looked up from her chair with immediate interest. "You found one of them," she said with satisfaction. "The lady said you would, once you started looking in the right places." "One of what, Ma?" "The markers. They were placed around the sacred sites to channel the earth's energy. That's why this place has healing power. The stones focus the natural forces that flow through the ground." Donovan unwrapped the disc and set it on the table, where it seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. As he watched, the carved symbols appeared to shift and change, though he knew that had to be a trick of the firelight. "How many of these are there?" he asked. "7," Constance replied without hesitation. "One for each of the sacred directions, plus the center stone that ties them all together." "But that one," she paused, looking troubled. "That one is different. That one was hidden where it shouldn't have been hidden, and its absence has left the sacred circle incomplete. Outside, the first shadows of evening were beginning to stretch across the snow, and somewhere in the darkening forest, Donovan could swear he heard the sound of digging, steady, rhythmic, like someone working with a purpose that couldn't wait for daylight. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams that felt more like memories. Donovan found himself standing in the same clearing where he'd discovered the stone disc, but the landscape was different, younger somehow, with trees that reached toward a sky unmarked by contrails or industrial haze. Native people moved through the forest with purposeful grace, carrying bundles of sage and cedar, their voices rising in harmonious chants that seemed to make the very air shimmer. In the dream, the lake was alive with light that emanated from deep beneath its surface, and the 7 stone markers formed a perfect circle around its perimeter. The center stone, larger than the others and carved with intricate spirals, sat on a small island that no longer existed in the waking world. The ceremonies he witnessed felt ancient and powerful, connecting the people to forces that modern society had forgotten existed. He woke to find his mother sitting by the window, watching the pre-dawn darkness with an expression of profound peace. She was holding something in her hands, another stone disc, this one smaller than the first, but carved with equally intricate symbols. "Where did you get that?" he asked, sitting up in the bed he'd made for himself on the cabin's small sofa. "It was calling to me," Constance said simply. "I could hear it singing during the night, so I went outside and followed the sound. It was buried right beside the front steps, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it." Donovan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His mother had managed to dress herself, walk outside in the freezing darkness, locate a buried artifact and dig it up, all while he slept soundly just a few feet away. Her physical condition made such exertion nearly impossible under normal circumstances, yet here she sat, looking more vibrant than she had in months. "Ma, you shouldn't be going outside alone at night. It's dangerous, and in your condition—" "My condition is improving, Danny," she interrupted gently. "Can't you see that? Each day I feel stronger, each night I understand more. This place is giving me something the doctors said was impossible. It's giving me back my life." As if to prove her point, she stood from the chair without the careful, painful movements that had characterized her recent mobility. There was strength in her posture that he hadn't seen in years, and when she walked to the kitchen to start making coffee, her breathing was steady and unlabored. The transformation was remarkable. But it came with an undercurrent of strangeness that made Donovan increasingly uneasy. His mother was becoming someone slightly different, still recognizably herself, but touched by knowledge and confidence that seemed to come from outside her own experience. After breakfast, he decided to systematically search for more of the stone markers. If there were 7 total, as Constance had said, then finding them all might provide answers to the questions that were multiplying daily. Using the surveyor's map as a guide, he began exploring the areas marked with symbols around the lake's perimeter. The third marker was buried beneath a lightning-struck pine that had fallen decades ago. As he dug it from the frozen ground, Donovan noticed that the temperature around the stone was noticeably warmer than the surrounding earth. When he lifted it from its resting place, the disc pulsed with the same heartbeat rhythm he'd felt in the first one, but stronger now, as if proximity to the other markers was amplifying their effect. The fourth marker revealed itself through pure intuition. Standing near a rocky outcropping on the lake's northern shore, Donovan felt drawn to a specific spot where the snow had melted in a perfect circle despite the surrounding ground being solidly frozen. The stone lay just beneath the surface, as if it had been working its way upward through the soil. By afternoon, he had located 6 of the 7 markers, each discovery feeling less like archaeological work and more like following a treasure map written in sensations he couldn't quite name. The stones seemed to call to each other, creating a network of energy that grew stronger as more pieces were assembled. The missing 7th marker, the center stone that Constance had mentioned, remained elusive. According to the map, it should have been located on what had once been a small island in the lake's center. But the current shoreline showed no sign of any island, and the water was too deep and cold for practical exploration. As evening approached, Donovan arranged the 6 recovered markers in the cabin's main room, positioning them according to the pattern shown on the surveyor's map. The effect was immediate and undeniable. The stones began to resonate with each other, creating a barely audible humming that seemed to emerge from the floorboards themselves. The air in the room grew warmer, and the light from the fireplace took on a golden quality that made everything look touched by sunset. Constance clapped her hands together with delight. "Do you feel it, Danny? The circle is almost complete. The healing energy is flowing again, just like it did when the ceremonies were properly conducted." Donovan did feel it, a sense of vitality and well-being that seemed to emanate from the arranged stones. His own minor aches and pains, accumulated from years of physical labor, faded to nothing. The chronic tension he'd carried in his shoulders since his father's death simply evaporated. Even his vision seemed sharper, as if a film had been removed from his eyes. But with the improvement in his physical condition came an increased sensitivity to the cabin's other occupants. The shadows in the corners of the room were no longer empty. They contained presences that watched with patient interest as the stone circle neared completion. When he turned to look directly at them, they faded to ordinary darkness, but in his peripheral vision, he could see figures in traditional native dress, their faces painted for ceremony, their eyes reflecting a wisdom that came from centuries of connection to this sacred place. "They're pleased with our progress," Constance observed, following his gaze. "But they're also concerned. The center stone isn't just missing. It's been deliberately hidden by someone who understood its power but chose to use it wrongly." "Pete Carlyle," Donovan said. "The pieces finally beginning to fit together. Yes, he found this place because the incomplete circle was calling out, trying to restore its balance. But instead of returning what he'd taken, he took more. The center stone is hidden somewhere beneath the lake, and its absence is what allows darker forces to influence this area." That night, as they prepared for bed, Donovan noticed changes in the cabin itself. The walls seemed more solid, the floors more level, as if the building were settling into a more perfect alignment with its foundation. The temperature remained comfortably warm, despite the fire burning lower than usual, and the usual nighttime sounds of an old building, creaks and groans and settling noises, were replaced by a profound silence that felt protective rather than ominous. But as he drifted toward sleep, Donovan heard something that made his eyes snap open. Footsteps on the roof, moving with deliberate purpose from one end of the cabin to the other. The sounds were too heavy and regular to be from animals, and they continued for nearly an hour before finally fading into the distance. In the morning, he would find tracks in the snow around the cabin, human footprints that circled the building multiple times before leading down to the lake's edge and disappearing at the waterline. But for now, surrounded by the protective energy of the stone circle, he felt safer than he had since arriving at this mysterious place. The footprints in the snow told a story that made Donovan's blood run cold. They circled the cabin in a perfect spiral, starting from the tree line and moving inward with mathematical precision. Each print was exactly the same depth, the same size, as if made by someone who walked with supernatural consistency. Most disturbing of all, the tracks showed no variation for terrain. They crossed fallen logs and rocky outcroppings without breaking stride, as if the walker had simply passed through solid obstacles. Following the trail to the lake's edge, Donovan found where the footprints entered the water and continued beneath the surface. Through the crystal-clear ice, he could see the impression of boots continuing down the sloping lake bottom, heading directly toward the deepest part of the lake, where the surveyor's map indicated the largest underwater chamber. "Well, that's not something you see every day," he muttered. But his attempt at humor felt hollow in the absolute silence that surrounded the lake. Even his own voice seemed to be absorbed by the air itself, leaving no echo or resonance. Back inside the cabin, he found Constance sitting at the kitchen table with a leather-bound journal spread before her. The book was old and water-stained, its pages yellow with age, and she was reading with the focused intensity of someone studying scripture. "Where did that come from?" Donovan asked, settling into the chair across from her. "It was hidden behind the loose stones in the chimney," she replied without looking up. "The ladies told me where to find it. It's Pete Carlisle's journal, and it explains everything that's been happening here." Donovan leaned closer to examine the journal. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, as if written by someone who feared he might not have time to finish his thoughts. The entries were dated sporadically over a period of 20 years, chronicling Pete's gradual discovery of the lake's secrets and his growing obsession with what lay beneath its surface. "Listen to this," Constance said. Reading from an entry dated 3 years earlier, "The dreams are getting stronger. I can see them down there in the big chamber, standing around something that glows like captured starlight. They want me to bring it back up, but I know what happens to men who steal from the dead. My grandfather told me stories about the old days when the natives would curse thieves with walking death. But the thing calls to me every night, and I'm starting to think maybe the curse is already on me." She turned the page and continued reading. "Found the underwater entrance today. Took me 6 tries to hold my breath long enough, but I made it into the main chamber. Christ almighty, the stories don't do it justice. There's a whole temple down there carved out of the living rock, and in the center, on a stone altar, sits the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's some kind of bowl or vessel made from stone that seems to hold light inside it. The Indians must have used it for their ceremonies, but they never understood its real power." Donovan felt a chill of recognition. "The center stone your invisible friends keep talking about, it's not a marker like the others. It's some kind of ceremonial object, a spirit vessel," Constance confirmed, her voice taking on the distant quality that accompanied her supernatural conversations. "The focal point for all the healing energy that flows through this place. But Pete didn't just steal it, he corrupted it. He used it for dark purposes, and now it's trapped between worlds, unable to fulfill its proper function." The journal entries grew increasingly erratic as Pete's obsession deepened. He wrote about voices calling to him from beneath the water, about dreams where ghostly figures begged him to return what he'd taken. But instead of heeding their warnings, he'd become convinced that the vessel held the secret to immortality. "December 15th, 1998, Constance read. "Tried the ritual again last night. The vessel glowed brighter than ever, and for a moment I felt like I was 20 years old again. But the things that came with the power, God help me, they're not human anymore. They want their sacred object back, and they're willing to wait as long as it takes. I can feel them watching me, counting the days until I make a mistake." The final entries revealed Pete's growing paranoia and desperation. He'd hidden the vessel somewhere beneath the cabin, convinced that the spirits couldn't reach it as long as it remained on dry land. But the incomplete ceremony circle above ground meant that the sacred site's power was slowly leaking away, creating an imbalance that attracted darker forces. "That's why you've been feeling better," Donovan said, understanding beginning to dawn. "The stone markers we found are restoring some of the original balance. But without the center vessel, the circle can't be completed, and every day it remains incomplete. The barrier between worlds grows thinner," Constance added. "Pete thought he could control forces that were old when his grandfather's grandfather was young. Now those forces are trying to set things right, but they need someone living to help them." Donovan studied his mother's face, noting the subtle changes that had occurred since their arrival. Her skin had a luminous quality that seemed to come from within, and her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom beyond her years. The healing she was experiencing came from her growing connection to the spiritual energy of the place. But that same connection was making her less human and more something else. "Ma, you're scaring me a little. The way you talk about these spirits, the way you seem to know things you shouldn't know." "I'm still your mother, Danny," she said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "But I'm also becoming something more. The vessel has been calling to those who can hear it, and my illness made me sensitive to its voice. That's why we were drawn here, why the cabin was available for such a low price. The spirits have been waiting for someone pure enough to help them restore the balance." That afternoon, armed with information from Pete's journal, Donovan began searching for the hidden entrance to the underground chamber system. According to the journal, Pete had discovered a way to access the underwater temple without swimming, a natural passage that connected the basement area beneath the cabin to the lake's cave system. The search led him to an area behind the cabin where the foundation stones were arranged differently than elsewhere. Instead of forming a solid wall, they created an archway that had been carefully concealed with smaller rocks and accumulated debris. When he cleared away the obstruction, cool air flowed from the opening, carrying with it the scent of deep water and ancient stone. "Found something?" he called to Constance, who appeared at his side with remarkable speed for someone who'd been bedridden just weeks ago. "That's the path Pete used," she confirmed. "It leads down to the sacred chamber, but it's not a journey to take lightly. The passage is guarded by those who died protecting this place, and they don't distinguish between thieves and honest visitors." As evening approached, Donovan made his decision. The answers they needed lay beneath the lake, in a temple that had been sacred long before Pete Carlyle corrupted it with his greed. Tomorrow, he would descend into the darkness and face whatever waited in the depths, not for treasure or power, but to restore the balance that his mother's life now depended upon. The underground passage descended at a gentle angle, carved from living rock by centuries of flowing water. Donovan moved carefully through the tunnel, his flashlight beam revealing walls marked with the same symbols he'd found on the stone markers. The air grew warmer as he descended, and somewhere ahead he could hear the distant sound of moving water. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, the passage opened into a vast chamber that took his breath away. The underground temple was exactly as Pete's journal had described, a natural cathedral carved from the bedrock, with walls that curved upward into darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. But it was the center of the chamber that commanded attention. A stone altar rose from the floor like a miniature mountain, its surface carved with intricate spirals that seemed to move in the shifting light. And there, exactly where Pete had described finding it, sat the spirit vessel. The bowl was roughly the size of a man's cupped hands, carved from a stone that seemed to contain its own light source. Even in the darkness of the underground chamber, it glowed with a soft radiance that pulsed in rhythm with something Donovan couldn't identify until he realized it was matching his own heartbeat. But the vessel wasn't alone on the altar. Arranged around it in a protective circle were objects that made Donovan's skin crawl. Human skulls, their eye sockets filled with small stones. Bundles of what looked like hair and fingernails tied with sinew. A knife with a blade so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Pete's additions," he whispered, understanding immediately what he was seeing. The corrupt rituals described in the journal had left their mark on the sacred space, perverting its original purpose and trapping the vessel between its healing nature and the dark energy that now surrounded it. As he approached the altar, the temperature in the chamber dropped dramatically. His breath began to steam and frost formed on the metal surface of his flashlight. But more disturbing than the cold was the growing sense that he was no longer alone in the chamber. Shapes moved in his peripheral vision, tall figures that wore the traditional dress of the original inhabitants, their faces painted with symbols that matched those on the chamber walls. But these spirits bore wounds that spoke of violent deaths, and their eyes held an anger that had been building for decades. "I'm not here to steal anything," Donovan said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "I'm here to put things right." The spirits regarded him with expressions that mixed hope with suspicion. One of them, a woman with intricate braids and a dress adorned with shells and feathers, stepped forward from the group. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from the walls themselves. "The thief is dead, but his corruption remains. The sacred vessel has been poisoned by blood and greed, and it cannot be cleansed by those who dwell beyond the veil. It requires the touch of the living, but only those pure of heart can survive contact with its power." "What happens if someone impure touches it?" Donovan asked. "They become vessels themselves, for forces that have no love for the living world." The thief understood this, which is why he surrounded our sacred bowl with protections of his own design. But those protections have made the corruption stronger, and each day that passes makes the cleansing more difficult. Donovan studied the altar more carefully, noting how Pete's additions formed their own pattern around the spirit vessel. The skull arrangement created a barrier that prevented the bowl's natural energy from flowing freely, while the darker objects seemed designed to channel that energy into something twisted and wrong. "How do I cleanse it?" "The corrupted objects must be removed and destroyed," the spirit woman explained, "but they have been bound to the vessel through blood sacrifice. Touching them will show you the deaths that created their power, and not all minds can survive such visions." "And if I don't try?" "The woman above grows stronger by drawing power from the incomplete circle, but that strength comes at a cost. She's becoming a bridge between worlds, and when the transformation is complete, she will belong fully to neither. The vessel will have claimed another guardian, and the cycle will begin again." The revelation hit Donovan like a physical blow. His mother's remarkable recovery wasn't healing, it was transformation. The spirits weren't helping her get better. They were preparing her to take Pete's place as the vessel's guardian, trapped forever in the space between life and death. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "There is," the spirit woman replied. "If the vessel can be cleansed and returned to its proper place in the circle above, the sacred site will be restored to its original purpose. The woman will be healed completely, returned to full life and health. But the cleansing requires a sacrifice. Someone must willingly take on the corruption that has built up over decades." "What kind of sacrifice?" "Not death, but change. The one who cleanses the vessel will carry the burden of all the evil it has absorbed. They will live, but they will be marked by darkness for the remainder of their days. It is not a fate to choose lightly." Donovan looked at the altar, then back at the assembled spirits. These people had died protecting this sacred place, and their descendants had been driven from their traditional lands by the same kind of greed that had motivated Pete Carlyle. Now they were offering him a choice: save his mother's soul at the cost of his own spiritual corruption, or let her complete the transformation that would trap her forever. "If I do this, will she remember what happened here?" "She will remember healing. She will remember peace. The darkness will be lifted from her, and she will live out her natural lifespan in health and happiness. But she will also remember that her son saved her, and that memory will be a source of strength for all her remaining years." The decision was easier than Donovan had expected. He'd spent his adult life trying to protect his mother from the hardships of mountain living, and now he had the chance to give her something no doctor could provide, a genuine cure and years of healthy life ahead. "Tell me what I need to do." The spirit woman smiled for the first time since appearing, and her expression transformed her from a figure of vengeance into something much more human. "Remove the corrupted objects one by one, starting with the skulls. Each one will show you a death, a moment of pain and terror that was used to bind power to this place. Experience the vision fully, accept the pain as your own, and the corruption will transfer to you instead of remaining in the vessel. And, when it's done, return the vessel to its place in the circle above. The sacred site will be restored. The balance will be maintained, and your mother will be free to live the life that was stolen from her by illness." Donovan stepped forward and reached for the first skull, its empty socket seeming to watch his approach with malevolent anticipation. As his fingers made contact with the bone, the chamber around him dissolved into vision and pain, and he began to understand the true cost of Pete Carlisle's decades of corruption. The first skull showed him the death of a young native woman, her life ending in terror as Pete Carlisle's knife found her heart. But as the vision unfolded, Donovan realized something that made his blood freeze. The murder hadn't happened decades ago. It was recent, perhaps only months before Pete's own death. And the woman's face was one he recognized from the spirits he'd seen in the chamber. The second skull revealed an even more horrifying truth. Pete hadn't just been stealing artifacts and performing corrupt rituals. He'd been murdering people to feed the vessel's growing hunger for blood. Each skull represented someone who'd come to the lake, seeking healing or spiritual guidance, only to become fuel for Pete's twisted version of the ancient ceremonies. As Donovan lifted the third skull, a new voice spoke from behind him, not the spirit woman, but something else entirely. Something that wore his mother's voice but carried an undertone of malice that made his skin crawl. "You're learning the truth at last, Danny, about this place, about Pete, and about me." He spun around to find Constance standing at the entrance to the chamber, but she was changed. Her eyes held the cold intelligence of something that had never been human, and when she smiled, her teeth seemed too sharp for her mouth. "Ma, your mother is still here," the thing wearing her face replied. "But she's not alone anymore. She hasn't been alone since the day you brought her to this place. We've been sharing her body, learning from her memories, preparing for this moment." The spirit woman who'd been guiding him stepped forward, her expression now filled with desperate urgency. "The vessel doesn't just store spiritual energy, it creates bridges between worlds. Pete's corruption opened pathways that should have remained sealed. And entities from the shadow realm have been waiting for someone pure enough to serve as a permanent host." "You're not healing her," Donovan said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You're possessing her, healing, possessing. Such limited words for something far more complex," the entity replied. "Your mother was dying, and we offered her life. She accepted our bargain willingly, though she didn't understand its full implications. Now she experiences perfect health, unlimited energy, and knowledge that spans centuries. In return, we have a foothold in your world. What do you want?" "The same thing every living being wants: survival and expansion. Your world is dying, poisoned by industry and greed. Our realm is eternal, but we need physical vessels to interact with material reality. The sacred sites like this one are doorways, but they require willing guardians to keep them open." Donovan looked at the vessel on the altar, understanding now why it pulsed with such power. It wasn't just a ceremonial object. It was a key that could lock or unlock the barriers between dimensions. Pete had used it to open pathways he couldn't control, and the entities that came through had been waiting for someone they could manipulate into serving their purposes. "My mother would never agree to this if she understood what you really are, wouldn't she?" The entity tilted Constance's head with predatory grace. "She's been communicating with us for days, learning about our world, understanding the gifts we can offer. The choice to continue our partnership is hers to make. As if summoned by their conversation, Constance's true voice emerged, layered beneath the entity's alien tones. "Danny, I can hear everything you're saying. These beings, they showed me what's coming for our world. Climate change, wars, diseases that will make my lung condition look like a minor inconvenience. But they can fix it. They can heal the earth the same way they healed me. At what cost, Ma? At the cost of sharing our world with beings who understand how to live in harmony with natural forces. They're not evil, Danny. They're just different. And they're offering us a chance to learn from them." The spirit woman shook her head urgently. "Do not listen to their lies. These are not the guardians who once blessed this place. They are parasites from the shadow realm, entities that consume life force and leave only emptiness behind. The true guardians, the spirits of my people, have been fighting to keep them contained. Your people failed," the entity sneered. "Your sacred sites were weakened by decades of neglect and industrial pollution. The old barriers are crumbling, and we are simply the first to find a way through. Others will follow, and they will be far less interested in cooperation than we are." Donovan realized he was caught between competing versions of truth, each side claiming to offer salvation while warning about the other's hidden agenda. But looking at his mother's face, still recognizable despite the alien intelligence looking out through her eyes, he knew what he had to do. "Ma, I need you to fight them. I need you to push them out and take control of your own body." "I can't, Danny. They're too strong, and I'm not sure I want to. Without them, I'll just go back to dying slowly. This way, I get to live and be part of something larger than myself. This isn't living. It's being a puppet for something that doesn't care about you. You don't understand." Constance's true voice grew stronger, more insistent. "I've seen their world, Danny. It's beautiful. No sickness, no suffering, no watching the people you love fade away. They're offering us paradise at the cost of your humanity." The entity laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the chamber. "Humanity is a temporary condition, a brief flicker between birth and death. We offer continuity, purpose, connection to forces that will outlast your son. Your mother has chosen wisely." But even as the entity spoke, Donovan noticed something important. The spirit woman and her companions weren't backing down or fading away. They were positioning themselves around the chamber, forming a protective circle around the altar. Their purpose wasn't just to guard the vessel. It was to prevent the Shadow Realm entities from gaining complete control over the sacred site. "There's still a choice," the spirit woman said urgently. "The vessel can be cleansed, but not in the way I first described. The corruption runs deeper than Pete's rituals. It goes back to the moment he first opened the pathways between worlds. To truly cleanse it requires destroying the bridges he created, which means severing the connection between your mother and the entities that now share her body. What happens to her if the connection is severed? She returns to her natural state, including her original illness. But she will be free to make her own choices about how to spend whatever time remains to her." "And what happens to them?" Donovan gestured toward the entity wearing his mother's face. "They return to their own realm, at least temporarily. But they will look for other ways through, other people to manipulate and control. This battle is larger than just your mother's fate. It's about whether humanity will remain in control of its own destiny." The entity smiled coldly. "Choose quickly, little man. Your mother's body is adapting to our presence, and soon the merger will be irreversible. She will still be herself, but she will also be us, and the distinction will become meaningless." Donovan looked at the vessel, pulsing with otherworldly energy, then at his mother's face, still beautiful despite the alien intelligence behind her eyes. The choice wasn't just about saving her life. It was about preserving her soul and protecting countless others from the same fate. He reached for the ceremonial knife Pete had placed among his corrupt additions to the altar. Its blade was dark with old blood, but as his fingers closed around the handle, he felt the weapon's true purpose flowing through him. This wasn't an instrument of sacrifice. It was a key, designed to cut the bindings between worlds and restore the natural order that kept humanity safe from forces it wasn't ready to comprehend. The ceremonial knife felt warm in Donovan's hand, its obsidian blade reflecting light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. As his fingers wrapped around the carved handle, knowledge flowed into his mind, not his own memories, but the accumulated wisdom of generations of guardians who had wielded this weapon to protect the boundaries between worlds. The entity wearing his mother's face took a step backward, its confident expression flickering for the first time since revealing itself. "You don't understand what you're holding, mortal. That blade has tasted the blood of both the living and the dead. It doesn't discriminate between friend and enemy. It simply cuts whatever connections bind spirit to flesh." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Donovan replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. The knife seemed to be lending him courage, along with knowledge, showing him possibilities he'd never imagined. The spirit woman moved closer, her expression mixing hope with desperate urgency. "The blade can sever the bindings, but the ritual requires precise timing. The shadow entities have deep roots in your mother's life force now. Cutting them free too quickly could kill her. But waiting too long will make separation impossible. Tell me what I need to do. First, the vessel must be prepared. The corruption Pete layered onto it has created false pathways that bypass the natural barriers between realms. Those must be destroyed before the cleansing can begin." Donovan studied the altar, noting how Pete's additions formed a complex pattern around the spirit vessel. Each skull, each bundle of hair and fingernails, each dark artifact represented a death that had been used to weaken the barriers between worlds. But they also formed a kind of map, a guide to the spiritual architecture that Pete had corrupted. The skulls are anchor points, he realized, understanding flowing through him like ice water. Pete used them to create a permanent gateway between the shadow realm and our world. That's how the entities got through in the first place, and how they continue to maintain their foothold, the spirit woman confirmed. Each death Pete committed was carefully chosen, people with natural sensitivity to spiritual energy, whose life force could be harvested to keep the gateway stable. The entity possessing Constance laughed. But there was an edge of worry in its voice now. "You're beginning to understand the magnitude of what you're attempting to destroy. This gateway represents decades of careful planning and preparation. Through it, my kind can offer your species salvation from the disasters that await your world." "By enslaving us," Donovan said, "by guiding you, by showing you how to live in harmony with forces greater than your limited understanding can encompass. Your mother has experienced just a taste of what we can offer: perfect health, expanded consciousness, connection to the infinite. Would you really condemn her to return to slow death and ignorance?" For a moment Donovan wavered, looking at his mother's vibrant face, seeing the energy and vitality that had replaced months of painful decline. He could almost convince himself that the entities were telling the truth about their benevolent intentions. But then he remembered the skulls on the altar, each one representing someone who'd been murdered to feed Pete's corrupt rituals. "Ma," he said, speaking directly to whatever remained of his mother's true consciousness, "I need you to fight them. Just for a few minutes. I need you to be yourself long enough to tell me what you really want." The entity's expression flickered, and for a brief moment, Constance's true personality emerged. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked around the underground chamber, taking in the gruesome altar and the assembled spirits of the dead. "Danny," she whispered, her voice frail and human again. "I've been so confused. They show me such beautiful things, but then I see the people Pete killed. I can feel their pain, their terror. These beings aren't healers, they're predators. They feed on suffering and call it transformation. Can you break free from them?" "Not for long. They're too strong, and I'm too weak. But Danny, you have to know, I chose this. When they first offered to heal me, I knew there would be a price. I just didn't understand how high it would be. The entity's influence reasserted itself, but not before Donovan saw something crucial in his mother's eyes. relief. She wanted to be free, even if it meant returning to her original condition. The fear of death had driven her to accept the entity's bargain, but now that she understood its true cost, she was ready to make a different choice. The ritual must begin now, the spirit woman urged. The longer they remain connected, the deeper their influence becomes. Soon, there will be nothing left of your mother to save. Donovan approached the altar with the ceremonial knife held before him. The blade seemed to vibrate with anticipation, and as he drew closer to Pete's corrupted additions, the obsidian edge began to glow with the same inner light as the spirit vessel. Start with the binding circles, the spirit woman instructed. Each skull is connected to the others through lines of spiritual energy. Cut those connections first, then destroy the individual anchor points. As Donovan raised the knife, the temperature in the chamber plummeted. Frost formed on the walls, and his breath came out in great billowing clouds. But the cold wasn't natural. It was the shadow realm's influence, trying to prevent him from severing their connection to the physical world. The first cut was the hardest. As the blade touched the invisible line connecting two of the skulls, Donovan felt the psychic backlash, like a physical blow. Images flooded his mind. Pete's victims, their final moments of terror, the gradual corruption of the sacred site over decades of misuse. But underneath the horror, he sensed something else, the original purpose of this place. The healing ceremonies that had once brought peace and restoration to those who sought them. Keep going, the spirit woman encouraged. Each connection you sever weakens their hold on this realm. The entity possessing Constance began to struggle, its form flickering between his mother's familiar appearance and something altogether more alien. You have no idea what you're destroying, it snarled. This gateway is the first of many. Even if you close it, others will open. Your species is too weak to resist what's coming. Maybe, Donovan replied, making the second cut. But we'll face it as ourselves, not as puppets for things that see us as food. With each severed connection, the atmosphere in the chamber changed. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the space began to lift, and the natural acoustics of the underground temple reasserted themselves. The spirits of Pete's victims, who had been trapped by the corrupt rituals, began to fade, not into nothingness, but into the peaceful rest that had been denied them. But as the binding circle weakened, the entity's desperation grew. It threw Constance's body forward, trying to reach the altar before Donovan could complete the ritual. But the spirit woman and her companions formed a protective barrier, their ghostly forms becoming solid enough to block the possessed woman's advance. The final cuts must be made quickly now, the spirit woman warned. Once the circle is completely broken, the backlash will be severe. The entities will try to take as much life force as possible before being forced back to their own realm. Donovan gripped the knife tighter and prepared for the most difficult part of the ritual. The last three connections were the strongest, anchored by skulls that had been soaked in more blood and bound with more powerful rituals. Breaking them would require not just cutting the spiritual connections, but accepting some of the corruption into himself. The price for freeing his mother from her supernatural bondage. Danny, no. Constance's true voice broke through the entity's control one final time. Don't sacrifice yourself for me. I'm old, I'm sick, I've lived my life. You have so much ahead of you. I've lived my life too, Ma, he replied, raising the knife for the final cuts. And this is how I choose to finish it, protecting the person who gave me everything. The blade descended toward the altar, its obsidian edge reflecting the swirling energies that connected the corrupted artifacts. In moments, the binding circle would be broken, the gateway would collapse, and the Shadow Realm entities would be forced to retreat. But the cost would be higher than anyone had anticipated, because as the knife made contact with the final connection, Donovan realized that the spirit vessel itself was about to shatter under the strain of containing decades of accumulated corruption. If the vessel broke, the explosion of uncontrolled spiritual energy would level not just the underground chamber, but everything within miles of the sacred site. The cure for Pete's corruption, might destroy the very land it was meant to heal unless someone was willing to contain the blast by channeling all that dark energy through their own body. As the final connection parted under the knife's edge, Donovan made his choice and reached for the spirit vessel with his bare hands, preparing to become a living lightning rod for forces that no human was meant to contain. The moment Donovan's hands closed around the spirit vessel, pain beyond description coursed through his body. It felt like being struck by lightning while drowning in acid, every nerve ending screaming as decades of accumulated corruption flowed through him. The vessel pulsed with malevolent energy, trying to pour all of Pete's collected darkness into his mortal frame. But something unexpected happened. Instead of being consumed by the corruption, Donovan felt his consciousness expand. The knife he'd used to break the binding circle wasn't just a tool, it was a conduit, and it had prepared him to channel spiritual energy in ways that Pete's victims never could have survived. The pain remained excruciating, but it became manageable, contained within barriers that the ceremonial blade had somehow carved into his soul. Around him, the chamber erupted into chaos. The Shadow Realm entities, cut off from their anchor points, shrieked with voices that existed only in the spaces between thoughts. They threw themselves against the weakening barriers that separated the dimensions, desperate to maintain their foothold in the physical world. But with each passing second, their forms became more translucent, their influence more tenuous. Constance collapsed to her knees as the possessing entity was forcibly expelled from her body. The years of illness returned in a crushing wave. Her lungs seized, her strength fled, and the vibrant color drained from her face like water from a broken vessel. But her eyes, when they met Donovan's, were entirely her own again. "Danny," she gasped, struggling to speak through the familiar pain of her condition. "What did you do?" "What needed to be done," he replied, though his voice sounded strange even to himself. The corruption flowing through the vessel was changing him, marking him in ways that would never completely heal. But it was also showing him things, the true history of the sacred site, the original purpose of the ceremonies, and the way forward. The spirit woman approached the altar, her expression mixing awe with concern. "You've contained the corruption, but you cannot hold it forever. It must be transformed, or it will eventually consume you from within. How do I transform it? By returning the vessel to its proper place, in the circle above. But not as it is now. First, it must be cleansed through the oldest of the sacred rituals. The corruption must be burned away with pure spiritual fire. Through the vessel's connection to his consciousness, Donovan could see the path clearly now. The underground chamber was just one part of a larger spiritual architecture that extended throughout the mountain. The stone markers he'd found formed the perimeter of a vast ceremonial space, with the cabin sitting at its exact center. But the true heart of the sacred site wasn't the building. It was the island that had once existed in the middle of the lake. The place where the most powerful ceremonies had been conducted. The island, he said, understanding flooding through him. It didn't disappear, it was deliberately submerged. Pete raised the lake level to hide the original altar. The spirit woman nodded. He diverted the mountain streams to flood the ceremonial ground, thinking that water would protect him from the spirits he'd angered. But water is a conductor, not a barrier. All he did was spread the corruption throughout the entire lake system, as if summoned by their conversation. The sound of rushing water echoed through the chamber. Somewhere above them, the lake was beginning to drain. The spiritual energy released by breaking the binding circle was reversing Pete's modifications to the landscape, returning the sacred site to its original configuration. "We have to get to the surface," Donovan said, clutching the vessel against his chest. The corruption it contained writhed like a living thing, but the ceremonial knife's influence kept it from overwhelming his consciousness. "The real cleansing has to happen on the original altar." Constance struggled to her feet, leaning heavily against the chamber wall. The return of her illness had left her weak, but her determination remained strong. "I'm coming with you." "Ma, you're not strong enough." "I'm strong enough for this," she interrupted firmly. "This is my fight too, Danny. I chose to make a bargain with those things. And I need to be part of setting it right. The spirit woman gestured toward a passage Donovan hadn't noticed before. A natural stairway carved into the living rock that led upward toward the surface. That path will take you directly to the island. But beware, the Shadow Realm entities haven't given up. They'll make one final attempt to reclaim the vessel before the cleansing can be completed. As they began their ascent, the sound of draining water grew louder. Through cracks in the rock, they could see streams of lake water rushing past, following channels that had been dry for decades. The mountain itself was participating in the restoration, undoing the damage that Pete's corruption had inflicted on the natural order. But with each step toward the surface, the vessel's weight seemed to increase. The corruption it contained was fighting the cleansing process, trying to drag Donovan back into the depths where darkness reigned supreme. Only his grip on the ceremonial knife kept him moving forward, its power providing a lifeline to the surface world and the healing ritual that waited above. They emerged from the underground passage into a world transformed. The lake had drained to reveal the island that Pete had hidden beneath its waters, a circular platform of carved stone that rose 30 feet above the new water level. Ancient. Symbols covered every surface, and at its center stood an altar that dwarfed the one in the underground chamber. But the sacred island wasn't empty. The Shadow Realm entities, driven from their underground stronghold, had gathered here for their final stand. They no longer bothered maintaining human appearances. Instead, they manifested as writhing shapes of darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. Their voices merged into a chorus of rage and desperation that made the air itself vibrate with malevolent energy. "They're stronger here," Constance observed, her breath coming in labored gasps as they made their way across the exposed lake bottom toward the island. "This is where the barriers between worlds are thinnest," Donovan nodded, feeling the truth of her words through the vessel's connection to his consciousness. The island had been designed as a meeting place between the physical and spiritual realms, a location where healing ceremonies could channel energy from sources beyond normal human reach. But that same accessibility made it vulnerable to invasion by entities that viewed humanity as food rather than partners. As they began climbing the stone steps that led to the island's summit, the shadow entities attacked. They didn't use physical force. Instead, they assaulted Donovan's mind with visions of failure and despair. He saw his mother dying in agony, her illness consuming her slowly while he stood helpless to prevent it. He experienced his father's final moments, feeling the Widowmaker branch crash across his shoulders and drive him into the rocky ground. Every fear, every regret, every moment of pain from his entire life played out in excruciating detail. But the ceremonial knife provided an anchor to reality. Each time the visions threatened to overwhelm him, its weight in his hand reminded him of his true purpose. The blade had absorbed the wisdom of countless guardians who had faced similar trials, and their strength flowed through him like a river of determination. "Don't listen to them," Constance urged, though her own face showed the strain of resisting similar psychological attacks. "They're trying to break your will before you can complete the cleansing." The climb to the altar felt like ascending a mountain, each step requiring tremendous effort as the shadow entities pressed their assault. But with every stride forward, the vessel's weight seemed to decrease slightly. The corruption it contained was beginning to respond to the sacred site's original purpose, preparing for the transformation that would either purify it completely or destroy everything within miles. When they finally reached the altar at the island's peak, Donovan understood why the original ceremonies had been so powerful. The stone platform was positioned at the exact intersection of multiple spiritual energy lines that crisscrossed the mountain range. Standing here was like being at the center of a vast web that connected sacred sites throughout the region. The vessel in his hands pulsed with recognition, responding to forces that predated human civilization. "Place it in the center depression," the spirit woman's voice whispered in his mind. She and her companions had followed them to the surface. But here in the open air, their forms were almost transparent. But be prepared. The moment the vessel touches the altar, the cleansing fire will begin. You must maintain contact throughout the entire process, no matter how much pain it causes. Donovan looked at the circular depression carved into the altar's surface. It was the exact size and shape of the spirit vessel, designed specifically to hold it during the most powerful ceremonies. Around the depression, channels had been carved into the stone, pathways for energy to flow between the vessel and the stone markers that formed the sacred circle's perimeter. "Danny," Constance said softly, placing her hand on his arm, "I want you to know that whatever happens here, I'm proud of you. You've become the man your father always knew you could be. We're both going to make it through this, Ma. Maybe. But if we don't, I need you to understand that I don't regret anything. Not the illness, not the bargain with those things, not any of it. Because it brought us here, to this moment, where we can make a difference for people we'll never meet." The shadow entities sensed what was about to happen and launched their most desperate attack yet. They threw themselves bodily at Donovan and Constance, trying to prevent the vessel from reaching the altar. But they had made a critical mistake. In abandoning their subtle approach for direct confrontation, they had made themselves vulnerable to the ceremonial knife's power. Donovan raised the blade and spoke words that came from somewhere deeper than memory, an invocation in a language he'd never learned, but somehow understood perfectly. The knife blazed with pure white light, and the shadow entities recoiled as if burned. In that moment of clarity, he placed the spirit vessel into the altar's depression and felt the mountain itself respond. The cleansing fire erupted from the stone, engulfing both him and the vessel in flames that burned away corruption without consuming flesh. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. The cleansing fire burned for 3 days and 3 nights, though Donovan experienced it as a single eternal moment of transformation. The corruption that had accumulated in the spirit vessel over decades of misuse was purged completely, but not destroyed. Instead, it was converted into something entirely different. The darkness became light, the death became life, and the fear became wisdom. When the flames finally subsided, Donovan found himself changed, but intact. The ceremonial knife had indeed marked him, leaving patterns of scars across his hands and arms that matched the symbols on the ancient stone markers. But rather than disfiguring him, these marks seemed to connect him more deeply to the natural world around him. He could sense the health of the forest, feel the movement of underground streams, and hear the whispered conversations of spirits who had found peace. Constance sat beside the altar, her breathing clear and strong for the first time in years. The cleansing fire had touched her as well, burning away not just the shadow entity's influence, but the illness that had been consuming her lungs. She wasn't just healed, she was restored to a vitality she hadn't experienced since her youth. "How do you feel, Ma?" Donovan asked, helping her to her feet. "Like I could climb every mountain in Montana," she replied with a laugh that rang pure and joyful across the water. "But more than that, I feel complete, like all the missing pieces of myself have been put back together." The spirit vessel now glowed with warm golden light that pulsed in rhythm with the mountain's own heartbeat. Its surface was no longer cold stone, but something that seemed to exist in the space between matter and energy. When Donovan touched it, he felt the vessel's true purpose flowing through him. Not to channel power for personal gain, but to maintain the balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. Around the lake, the 6 stone markers that Donovan had discovered began to glow with the same golden light. The sacred circle was complete again, functioning as it had been designed to function centuries ago. The barriers between dimensions were restored, but not as impermeable walls. Instead, they served as filters, allowing beneficial spiritual energy to flow while keeping malevolent forces at bay. The spirit woman appeared one final time, her form now solid and radiant, rather than ghostly and translucent. "The sacred site is healed," she said, her voice carrying the music of wind through pine trees. The balance is restored, and the guardianship passes to new hands. What does that mean exactly? Donovan asked. It means this place is your responsibility now, as it was Pete's before he corrupted it, and ours before the old ways were forgotten. The vessel will remain here, channeling healing energy to all who seek it with pure intentions. But it requires living guardians to protect it from those who would misuse its power. Constance looked around the island with understanding dawning in her eyes. You're asking us to stay here permanently, not trapped here, as Pete was by his own greed and paranoia. Free to come and go as you choose, but committed to maintaining the sacred circle and ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The proposition was exactly what Donovan had been hoping for without realizing it. A purpose larger than himself, a way to use the skills and knowledge he'd gained to protect something genuinely important. And his mother would have the healing environment she needed, while also finding meaning in helping others who came seeking relief from their own ailments. There will be visitors, the spirit woman continued, people drawn by the same forces that brought you here, searching for healing or answers, or simply a place where the modern world hasn't crowded out the ancient wisdom. Some will be genuinely in need. Others will be curiosity seekers or treasure hunters. Part of your role will be discerning which is which. Over the following weeks, as they settled into their new lives as guardians of the sacred site, Donovan and Constance discovered the truth of the spirit woman's words. People did come, first a trickle, then a steady stream of visitors who had somehow learned about the healing properties of Whitefish Lake. They came with cancer, with broken hearts, with spiritual emptiness that modern medicine couldn't touch. And gradually, carefully, Donovan learned to use the spirit vessel's power to help them. Not to cure everything. Some burdens were meant to be carried, some lessons could only be learned through struggle, but to provide the strength and clarity people needed to face their challenges with courage. Constance thrived in her role as counselor and teacher, sharing the wisdom she'd gained from her brush with the shadow realm. Her experience with the possessing entities gave her unique insight into the dangers of seeking power without understanding its true cost, and she helped many visitors avoid the same mistakes that had corrupted Pete Carlisle. The cabin itself was transformed, expanded with additional rooms to accommodate visitors who needed extended stays during their healing process. But the changes felt organic, as if the building were growing rather than being constructed. The sacred site seemed to reshape itself to meet the needs of its new guardians, providing exactly what was required without compromising the natural balance. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had departed and the lake reflected the first stars of night, Donovan and Constance would sit by the restored stone circle and listen to the mountain's ancient songs. They had found something that most people spent their entire lives searching for, a sense of belonging, a purpose that transcended personal desires, and the knowledge that their lives mattered in ways that would ripple forward through generations. The spirit vessel pulsed gently in its place of honor at the circle's center, no longer a tool of corruption, but a beacon of hope. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, Donovan could sense the presence of other sacred sites, other guardians who shared their commitment to maintaining the balance between worlds. Their real work was just beginning, but for the first time in years, both mother and son felt truly at peace.